Hey folks, Blackross here, and welcome to a video that I should have done a couple of months back, but oh well, I'm finally doing it now. The top 10 bosses in Dark Souls 3. Yes, it's about time I finally got started on a top 10 on Dark Souls 3. I've done it on Dark Souls 1, 2, Bloodborne. However, I haven't done one for Demon Souls, and I have a very good reason why, because there's not that many interesting bosses. So if you deem me for wanting to do a top 10 or top 5 bosses of Demon Souls, then I guess I can do one. If not, then I don't have to do it. Hee hooray! Although I feel inclined that I still need to complete the trilogy and do a Dark Souls 3 top 10 bosses. Just like within the last couple lists that I've done, the lists are basically my first impressions as well as follow-up after I've learned how to fight them, and of course no repeated bosses. The good thing is that, well, there's not that many repeated bosses, and unlike my last top 10s, this one actually contains at least one. I know I lied to myself, but hear me out whenever I actually talk about it. So without further ado, let's get started and talk about the top 10 Dark Souls 3 bosses. Top 10 Dark Souls 3 bosses. I don't know why I'm repeating that over and over and over again. Here's the intro. Number 10 goes to Inductria Gundyr. Actually, I'm lying. That one's a piece of shit, and as well as a piece of crap. No, the real number 10 boss in this one is actually its counterpart, known as Champion Gundyr. A lot of us who have fought Inductria's Gundyr was more or less having either an easy time fighting it within our first playthrough, or in some of our stupidity dilemma, we fought it and failed a couple of times. If you watch my channel, you practically know how it worked out. But regardless of that, Champion Gundyr is number 10 because, unlike his previous fight, halfway through point actually gets a little bit more challenging instead of easier. Because if you've replayed it multiple times like I have, chances are it does get easier. Champion Gundyr, on the other hand, does not get easier, as instead it gets intensively harder because it hits harder than a frickin' train. So yeah, naturally, Champion Gundyr is number 10 because, quite frankly, it proves a little bit more of a challenge than his previous form, and at the same time, it still stays difficult, even whenever you're doing a pretty difficult challenge. The way that I figured how to beat this one is basically summon up Swordmaster whenever you have the ability to summon him, and then that way creates a decoy. However, he doesn't last that long, so make sure you take him out as quickly as possible and watch out for those heavy hits, because he will hit hard. Number 9 actually goes to the Twin Prince boss fight, Walderin Older Prince and Lothric Younger Prince. Now, why did I pick this one in particular? Because unfortunately, it stays pretty difficult for the most part. Plus, it's a 2-stage boss fight, regardless of what you do. Needless to say, the story behind Prince Lothric was actually pretty interesting, and yet we never really did get a clarification as to what made him, turn on the ideal of rekindling the flame. So in lore aspects, it's pretty interesting, but we still don't really know how he came to this decision. Maybe he came up with it on his own. A lot of people believe that one of the twin serpents came to him and told him basically to hey, here's an ideal, screw the flames, do your own thing. That's what people are coming up with, but so far we've never really encountered any of the two. We see statues of them, but we never really encountered him per se. So, in terms of lore, it's kind of difficult to explain as to how he came up with this assumption. But in terms of boss fight, his older prince can be pretty difficult, but when it gets to the younger part version, where he's basically playing giddy-up with his older brother, There's an instant joke in there, isn't there? I'm not looking forward to hearing the comments for that one. But basically, once he decides to get to that phase, oh boy, things start to get a little bit harder, because not only do you have to watch out some of his holy magic, but you also gotta watch out for the flame attacks that his older brother does. And even if you manage to knock out the older brother, if his younger brother's still alive, chances are you're still gonna have to kill it. Because he'll revive his older brother multiple times. I find it to where if you manage to actually get behind both of them, you actually do damage to both of them. So that way, whenever the younger prince and the older prince finally reaches to 0, you don't have to worry about a second revival. Trust me, it's more of a pain than you think. Number 8 goes to Champion Gravet. Now, there is actually a particular reason as to why I find this fight pretty interesting. Mostly because, number 1, the wolves. Actually, the wolf itself. The wolf itself is actually probably the only interesting part, because it more or less feels like a buffed up version of Grey Wolf Sith. And I love that boss fight. But this boss fight in particular is very interesting because you're fighting the basic Gravet himself. And at first, whenever looking at trailers, I thought that if that shield summons up the wolf symbol, I thought that wolf would be summoned up automatically. No, it's more of a halfway point, and he's going to summon it regardless. So it's like, oh, I'm going to fight it either way. Interesting. I've actually fought this one by myself for once, because when I tried beating it before, I was too drunk to where I couldn't fight it. But I did fight him by myself, and this time I was actually able to do something. Make sure you take out the Gravet as quickly as possible, and then take out the wolf. Because, trust me whenever I say this, once it gets to the halfway point on that part, he gets more savage. Very savage, in fact. So, word of warning. Kill the small one first, then kill the wolf. That's the advice I can give you right now. Number 7 goes to the Demon Prince. Now, this particular boss fight is basically a 2-stage / 2-wonder boss fight. Or as most people like to call it, a repeat of Ornstein and Smough boss fight. Which, technically they're right, it's somewhat like that, because depending on which one you kill first, depends on how the second boss fight's going to be. Even though you have to kill both of them first, and then whoever is killed last gets to be revived again. So in other words, this gets a little bit harder. Now, the one thing I found out is that, honestly, you want to kill the demon from below first. I think. Is it the demon from below? 1 second. Yeah, it's demon from the below you gotta defeat first. Because if you defeat the demon of pain first, things get harder, I found out. He shoots lasers. That's not a good time. You wouldn't think shooting lasers would be that hard, but in this case, he's very accurate with that laser. Fighting him whenever you beat the demon from below first, and then beat the demon of pain, actually proves to be a little bit easier time, because he more or less summons up meteors. And while you would think that would be harder, depending on if you summon up a party member or not, that will more likely get a chance to aim at them, rather than you, giving you a chance to get the fuck back. And while as much as I was frustrated at this boss fight in particular, it wasn't really that bad, because I actually found it pretty enjoyable. Again, it was pretty tough, but I later on actually enjoyed it because it was kind of a reminiscence to Ornstein and Smough. But like I said, defeat the demon from below first, rather than the demon of pain first, because trust me whenever I say this, the demon of pain will deliver the pain. Actually, I got that backwards. Ah, well, you get the joke. The point is, defeat the demon from below first, and then defeat the demon of pain. And then you fight the Demon Prince, which actually is pretty interesting. The concept detail of the Demon Prince isn't really too fascinating, but I did enjoy it regardless, so there you go. Number 6 goes to Dancer of Beryl Valley. Now, there's actually more reason than one as to why I like the Dancer of Beryl Valley. Number 1... Girl, shake that ass for me. Shake that ass for me. Oh. And number 2, it's actually been increasingly more or less of a love and hate relationship with this boss fight, because on the one hand, I've never been able to actually regularly found an easy way of actually fighting this one. And I say easy way because for some parts of me, I've actually found it harder to where I've had to do it by myself. Whereas if I had summoned somebody else, the fight isn't so intensively bad. But I actually did beat the Beryl Dancer Valley. Actually, I got that backwards. Dancer of Beryl Valley. I was able to beat her by myself. And honestly, it's actually a lot tougher than you think, because in a sense, yeah, it does become a dance. It's sort of a waltz in a way. But if you can manage to time your dodging as well as figure out when to attack and make certain she doesn't brutally rape you. Seriously, when she pulls out those 2 blades, that can be a little bit rapey at times. The dancer isn't really that bad, and I've actually enjoyed the boss fight itself. Now, as for the lore aspect, it's pretty interesting, because technically she was actually summoned by Pontet Sullivan, both her as well as Bort, which is interesting. So that kind of tells you that, hey, the dancer and Bort was actually summoned to invade Lothric? That's interesting. That's actually an interesting concept. I like that. Also, I like the area whenever it catches on fire. That's a pretty cool detail. I really admire the actual stage as well as the fight itself. Like I said, there's more than one reason why I like this boss. Number 5 goes to the Soulless Cinder. Weird, ain't it? He just barely reaches over my top 5. He's not number 1, and he's nowhere above 5. He's just right there on 5, and it's like, oh, okay. Oh, I should probably talk about the actual boss itself. Well, he's the final boss. What more do you want to expect? Actually, I lie. He is pretty interesting in his first phase, where basically you fight him normally, and then you find out later on he changes different moveset. You can change it to a Pyromancer, you can change it into a Spearlancer, Spellcaster, whatever. It's pretty interesting to see all these changing abilities continuously throughout the fight as it goes on. And when you finally beat him, he evolves to his second stage. Now, the second stage, a lot of people have theorized that maybe this is probably Gwyn himself, King Gwyn. Which, honestly, in terms of lore, it kind of makes sense, because he was technically like the first lord to link the flame. He's the one who created the flame, so therefore it would make sense if that lore is true. So it's pretty interesting. Also, the fact that the song is in there, pretty creepy. It's like right there, and then it's changed up a bit, and it's like, huh, this is cool. Also, he's still kicking my ass because I can't parry worth shit. Number 4 goes to the Abyss Watchers. Now, while some people may not have enjoyed this boss fight in particular, I personally have enjoyed it because of how it kind of changes up, you know. At first, you're fighting one, and then later on you fight a number of these guys. And I think the number is up to like 3, I think. But the funny thing is, if the main one attacks the other 2 will actually turn on him. And it's like, okay, this is actually pretty funny, I think. So it makes the fight even more intense and more interesting. When you finally beat the first phase, his second phase comes up, where he basically goes out all fire blazing and all. He doesn't really have a gun, so I can't really use the phrase gun blazing. Personally, I've just rather enjoyed this particular fight, because not only was he the first Lord of Cinder that you actually fight, it was more of a concept of like, okay, here's how the change of gameplay goes from generic to this. Also, he was actually one of the first 2-phase boss fights that you actually go through the entire game. Plus, I like the armor set. It's pretty freaking cool. I love it. Number 3 goes to Yorm the Giant. I know, a lot of you are going to be extremely confused because this is actually probably one of the easiest boss fights, considering the fact that all you gotta do is grab the Sword of Storms, and then, boom! Pretty much dead. But here's the thing, while Yorm may not be as challenging in terms of a boss fight, he's really interesting in terms of lore aspects. Like, seriously, if you actually look into the lore of the individual areas themselves, Yorm is actually more of a respected king and lord on his own. He sacrificed himself in order to kindle the flame, but basically what happened was that every single time a flame is rekindled, it basically releases like a Big Bang Theory type of thing, where all the corpses are basically merged into the ground and kind of welded in there. And the entire profane capital itself, you actually get to see all the people actually kind of like burned to a crisp and kind of welded together. So it's kind of interesting. And it makes sense as to why Yorm would actually want to kind of like betray everything that he has been taught and go with Prince Lothric in the idea of just going against the flame. Kind of works. Plus, I like the... Plus, I do like the little story segment side quest that they give Sigurd and Yorm. It's pretty touching and it's pretty freaking cool. I love it. Number 2, the Nameless King. Out of all the bosses that I've ever had to fight, this one, still to this day, stays difficult. It stays hard for me, it stays nearly impossible to beat. But it's still pretty fun to actually fight. The first phase, you fight the King of Storms, which is basically the dragon. But however, though, when you finally beat that first part, you actually go into the second phase, and the Nameless King. Now, there's something interesting about the lore behind the Nameless King. Why would it be called Nameless King? Probably because he probably forgot his name. However, there are a lot of people theorizing that because of the abilities and because of the weaponry that he's using, he's probably Solaire, which would make sense. But personally, I don't see that a possibility of being that, because I don't think Solaire ever kindled the flame. Or if he did, we don't really know. He was more or less looking for the sun. Or his own son, at least. So in a sense, I guess, if this so-called legend thing links up where Solaire is the Nameless King, more or less he gave up that quest and just joined with the dragons. How interesting. However, though, this boss fight, still to this day, kicks my ass. Every single time. But I did beat him by myself once. Never again will that happen. I definitely need backup. And now it's time for the honorable mentions, because there's actually one boss that I wish to put on the list, but I couldn't because of certain conditions. And as I talk about this boss, you'll find out what that condition is. Dark Eater Mirrid. Now, there's actually a reason why I put her as, or it, I'm not sure, as an honorable mention. And that's because of one simple reason. I have yet to beat that boss. I still need to figure out how to beat it, and I've got a couple builds that I've actually been wanting to try against the dragon. Because I am a dragon slayer. It's my destiny to kill dragons, for crying out loud. And this dragon is no exception. I will eventually one day try to beat this one. Until then, though, it is going to be within the honorable mentions because of how difficult that boss fight is. Oh, is that ever a tough boss fight? Alright then, so let's go back to the number order that I've talked about and talk about each individual boss that I've placed in order. Number 10, Champion Gundyr. Number 9, Lodrin, Elder Prince, and Lothric, Younger Prince. Number 8, Champion Gravetender. Number 7, Demon Prince. Number 6, Dancer of Boreal Valley. Number 5, Soul of Cinder. Number 4, Abyss Watchers. Number 3, Yorm the Giant. Number 2, Nameless King. And now, ladies and gentlemen, to talk about the number 1 boss that I absolutely love in this game. Ironically enough, though, it is actually probably one of the hardest bosses that I've encountered next to Dark Eater Mirrid. Who is that? Slave Knight Gale.
What? Still here? Hand it over, that thing, your dark soul. For my lady's painting.
There's actually a couple reasons as to why I put Slave Knight Gale into the number 1 spot. And the first reason is basically the fact of who he technically is. He's a slave knight. Knights are generally hired by kings and royalty. So for Gale to be called a slave knight means that he's more or less indebted to a particular person. And who is that person? The Painter Girl, which was actually found in the DLC Ashes of Ariandel. And what makes it interesting is the fact that technically, if you think about it, both DLCs are not actually part of the main game, but rather they're their own side story. So in other words, once you beat Ashes of Ariandel, you proceed on to the Ring City, and you find out what exactly Slave Knight Gale has actually been up to this whole time. What is he doing? He's trying to find the Dark Soul. So what is a Dark Soul? Because I think that's something that a lot of people don't actually consider looking into, is the fact that what is a Dark Soul? I mean, that's the name of the series, it's the Dark Soul series. But we never actually find out what technically it means. And I actually decided to take in the investigation of actually looking into what is a Dark Soul. And I found out what it is. And holy shit, it comes full circle around. Seriously, it goes back to practically Dark Souls 1. How weird is that? Okay, so a Dark Soul is basically a person who basically divided his souls into multiple parts and given them to individual factions. Who do we know that's already done this before? None other than Lord Gwyn himself, when he divided his souls up and given it to the Scaleless, Gravelord Nito, the Witch of Chaos, known as Quelaag herself, and then of course the 4 Kings, which is interesting because he was the Dark Soul. When was the Dark Soul? The first Dark Soul. How weird is that? In Dark Souls 3, however, the Dark Souls themselves were the individual royal kings, where basically they were monitoring the entire worldscape itself. And they basically had a, suppose you'd call a legend, in a sense, of where there was a red cape person who would come to kill them, to devour their dark souls. And Slave Knight Gale was that person who devoured their souls. And what happened to him? He turned into a big hulking beast. Which is interesting because that's how the first phase goes. He basically more or less acts like an actual beast, and you're basically having to fight the fight itself as he's just basically slamming his sword and just walking on all fours. Once you get halfway through, on the other hand, though, he makes a sudden realization that after all the Dark Souls that he has swallowed up, he himself has become a Dark Soul pygmy itself. And that's when things get harder. Holy shit, does it get harder. He starts standing on 2 legs, and he begins to have an extra attack pattern, which is his cape. That thing does a lot of damage if you're not careful. The fight gets even more intense, and he starts to use his repeated crossbow, which is pretty freaking awesome. The entire stage, if you've ever looked at how big the stage is, it's freaking nuts. It's humongous. Probably the biggest stage that I think any Dark Souls boss fight has ever had. So I mean, it's just, holy shit, it was so epic. And the lore itself basically more or less ties up the Soul series entirely. Freaking beautiful. But what's really even more awesomer is how it ends, basically. What basically translates within the Dark Souls 3 DLC, The Ring City, after you beat Slave Knight Gale, was that the entire world was basically put on hold, basically, for time. And once you basically awaken her, she eventually unfreezes time and everything begins to degrade into ash. Which is weird, but funny in a way. But also, too, something even more interesting happens as well. In a sense, From Software ended Dark Souls. In a sense. Now, they have never really claimed that they are done with Dark Souls. They're just saying that they're done for now. So, will it come back? I'm not sure. But the way it ends, I'm personally happy with it, because by far, Slave Knight Gale is probably the coolest boss fight in Dark Souls 3, and I've really enjoyed it. And that's it for the top 10 Dark Souls 3 boss fight. I finally got to do it. Finally, it took me forever to finally get into the mood to actually want to put this together. So I hope you enjoyed this one. And please, let me know in the comments below as to what's your favorite bosses in Dark Souls 3. Or what's your favorite boss in Dark Souls in general. So, with that said, the trilogy is over. And I can finally end the top 10 Dark Souls bosses, finally. I've been meaning to get to this for a long time. A very long time. Anyway, though, that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, this is Blackcross signing off. Take care, guys.